Our moderator today is Shannon Schlecht, the Executive Director of the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute. And our panelists include Katie Horde, Global Director of Agricultural Innovation and Sustainability at Anheuser-Busch, Christina Fursley, Head of Global Corporate Affairs and Communications at Ocean Spray, John Reich, Scientific Program Director at the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and Joseph Affolter, Director of the MTRAC Ag Bioinnovation Hub at Michigan State University. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be taking some questions from the audience throughout our discussion. So if you'd like to ask a question, we just ask that you type it out in the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll be taking a look at those questions and we'll work to get those in front of our panelists throughout the conversation. We'll also try to reserve some time at the end for any remaining questions. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Shannon to get us started with our conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate, and welcome to everyone and to our panelists as well. And thank you to New Lab for hosting a webinar on this very important topic of sustainable agriculture. I look forward today to a very exhilarating conversation and discussion on agriculture and sustainability with our panelists, and also look forward to your questions from the audience in terms of what are your key areas that you're interested in terms of sustainability and agriculture. They're very broad topics, but we've got a great set of experts here to answer those questions. Agriculture is constantly facing challenges, as I think we hear from a weather issue, from a price issue, from pests, and all these different threats that come across to our agricultural producers and the challenges that they face every day. But we're also poised to solve many of the challenges, I think, that are facing the world as consumers strive toward more sustainable products. This grand challenge that we have in agriculture of feeding the world in a more sustainable manner is one that I'm positive that innovation can solve, and the work of entities that we'll hear from today are working very hard to solve that grand challenge as well. And it's going to be a great discussion in terms of digging into this topic further. So with that, let's get started, and we'll get started maybe with the basics of what is sustainable agriculture in your view. It's a very broad term when we think about sustainability. And Katie, I'll start with you in terms of what is AB InBev doing around sustainable agriculture? How do you define it? And what's driving sustainable agriculture in your view?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you to New Lab for hosting this today. Just to start off first, why is agriculture important to AB InBev? Well, beer is a natural product, right? And we need quality ingredients to make quality beer. And that starts with the farmer. So back in 2018, we launched our new sustainability goals, our 2025 public commitments. And the one that's most relevant for our conversation today is of course, smart agriculture. And we committed that by 2025, 100% of our direct farmers will be skilled, connected, and financially empowered. So what does that actually mean? So when we talk about skilled, that means that farmers will have access to varieties that are appropriate for their environment, as well as the crop management skills and training to help support sustainable farming. When we talk about connected, it's about access to information and analytics that are going to help farmers make those in-season decisions that are critical to their production. And then around financial empowerment, right? And this might be the most important piece, is how do we think about farmers' access to financial tools and also training around that. And just to give you some context, we have agricultural development programs, so agronomists and researchers working across 13 different countries with over 20,000 farmers, focusing in on our 6 priority crops. So that's ranging from barley, hops, cassava, sorghum, rice, and corn. And so that's the approach that we're taking with farmers there. But ultimately, we're trying to get to that impact where we're building those resilient supply chains, and that varies from social impact as well as environmental, and that really is depending on that local context. Again, operating across these 13 countries and various crops, that might look different, the challenges that we face and the priorities that we may have, but we have that framework of working with the farmer, and that was something that's really important to us, is making sure that we're taking that farmer-centric approach. And just lastly, I'll quickly wrap up, but I think a few important things in that that we really focus on are transparency, right? Knowing who our farmers are and the way that they're farming, technology, So whether that's looking at analytics, we've invested in our own platform. We partner with startups in the ag tech space as well, or looking at infield technology. Research is a key piece of this. I mentioned we have our own research group that look at breeding and crop management. And then of course, partnership. This is not something that we can do alone. Our crops are grown in rotation. So it's really important that we have that partnership, and we have a few mechanisms that we're looking to leverage partnerships, one being our 100+ accelerator, where we're sourcing the startup community for solutions to help achieve our sustainability challenges.
Thanks, Katie. That's a lot of effort and covering a broad area. 20,000 farmers and 6 crops is that's a big portfolio and a lot of different opportunities that exist across that. Let's pivot to Joe. And Joe, you run a really unique center up at Michigan State University. And could you talk a little bit about the role of the Innovation Hub and Michigan State University in terms of how you're working with the agricultural industry? You're on mute, Joe.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, New Lab, for hosting this today. And thanks for the question. Yeah, the Great Lakes region is really unique. Of course, Shannon is in this region as well. It's home to a lot of different crops. It's partly moderated by the Great Lakes and partly made more severe by the Great Lakes, depending on which way you look at it. But Michigan is home to about 50,000 farms who produce 300 different products on an average acreage of about 195 acres. Pretty small, actually, from a national standpoint, very specialized. So all that to say, Michigan State was the first land grant agricultural university, and it's one of its core missions is to really help that ecosystem be healthy and advance, et cetera. So the program that I direct at Michigan State, Michigan Translational Research and Commercialization program, is partly funded by the state of Michigan, partly funded by the university, to really help the academic researchers across the state of Michigan, not just at Michigan State, take some early stage innovations that they're working on with some eye toward agriculture or the bioeconomy, and help them put that basic science into some of its first initial prototypes that have the field application in mind, that have the problem in the field in square view. But really, many times, this is the first step these researchers ever take. So this is what we call translational research. Obviously, one of the objectives is to get these foundational scientific discoveries into a commercial framework and advancing toward commercialization as rapidly and effectively as possible. So it's a very interesting program. We've seen a broad array of technologies come out of it, as you might imagine. So that's what it's all about.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, the effort to accelerate solutions is so critical, right, in terms of how we look at what's coming through the pipeline and how do we get it out into industry and put it to good use. So it's great to hear about your program and what's going on at Michigan State. And as you said, the diversity of crops that's going across Michigan is just tremendous in terms of its role in feeding the world and meeting consumer needs. John, I'm going to pivot over to you at the Foundation for Food and Ag Research. You work a lot on public-private partnerships to address the challenges facing the food and agricultural industry. So you get a pretty unique, I would say, lens or inside track in terms of what's happening or what are the views of both the private sector and the public sector. And just wondering if you could share a little bit about where you see a lot of overlap across public and private and where you see a little bit of divergence in your work at FAR.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Shannon. Thanks for New Lab for having me here. And you're right, so FAR is a research funding organization. We are funded by Congress, and part of our purview is to fund public-private partnerships. So we're a public part of a number of private partnerships. And how we typically do this is that we try to aim for transformative research that brings people together. And so one of the models that we have working at FAR is really to, and it's just one of the models that we have, is really to create consortia and also other projects where multiple stakeholders can come together. And our consortia could be many different types of things. They could just be thought leaders coming together, or they can be funding consortia. And we've created a number of funding consortia here, focused on areas that we think are really ripe for public and private partnerships. So those are risky areas of research, and those typically tend for us to be really good areas of collaboration. So how we view it, and when we started creating these, we viewed it that companies can sometimes be risk adverse and may not invest in too many things that are risky because it can take too long to get results and to make money off of. So we try to figure out what those risky areas are and where areas are that companies are interested in. So I'll just give you a few examples of some of the things that we have done with the private sector. And remember, this isn't all inclusive. So some of the areas that we focus on are plant-based proteins. FAR has created a consortium called Crops of the Future. It was actually our first consortium model. It's a focus on pre-competitive research, looking at crop resilience, crop diversity, market development of new crops. And they recently just had a call for proposals with all the companies that were part of it on plant protein enhancement project. So that was an open RFA, and people are actually applying for that now. We're also working on other areas such as development of new crops. So we consider this a really risky area, and we really want to focus on what the consumers want. So there are multiple projects that we're working on FAR, but one in particular we're calling Harvest for Health. And it's all based on the fact that a lot of plants can be used as crops and often are on a small scale, but these plants are less developed, right? And these plants can also be one day more sustainable crops for in the future. We work on new production systems, such as in our Precision Indoor Plants initiative, and then, focusing somewhat more on our bioeconomy. So, and the fact that business is not interested in things that increase their costs, so for drop-in chemicals or new chemicals for products. And so we think there's a role for public and private sectors coming together there to achieve the full benefits of a bioeconomy.
Fantastic, thanks, John. Yeah, the development of new crops is a long and costly process, right? But a lot of interest in looking at biological diversity and new ingredients and that whole side of the ledger as well. So great to hear your work that's happening at FAR, and look forward to hearing more from you here in a little bit. I'm going to turn to our last panelist, Christina at Ocean Spray. And a question for you just on sustainability. I think we've all been through a lot in the last several months in terms of the pandemic and just the food supply chain and what the focus has been of consumers. And just wondering if you've seen any changes in the interest in sustainability at Ocean Spray among your producer members of the cooperative as we've gone through some challenging times here in this past year.
Sure. Just to back up a second on Ocean Spray and why sustainability matters to us as a cooperative. For those who don't know, Ocean Spray is a farmer-owned cooperative. We are owned by 700 small family farmers across North America and South America, roughly 18 acres per farm, so small size. And over the last year, I'd say 18 months, we really launched our sustainability program, which focuses on regenerative agriculture, packaging, and supply chain. And as it comes to agriculture, the last year, before everything kind of went a little crazy for the pandemic, we had begun the process of verifying our cranberries as sustainably grown through the Sustainable Agriculture Initiatives, FSA, which was completed in December. And then everything kind of went haywire. So to answer your specific question, our cranberry farmers, what they say is the cranberry is going to grow the way it grows, pandemic or not. Our focus on sustainability and on our 6 pillars there of water, soil health, emissions, worker safety, ecosystem biodiversity, and farmer succession being one of the most important, continue on, if anything, more so, with more interest and more strength than prior. We want to make sure that in the face of dual crises, that of climate change and that of this pandemic, that our farmers are equipped to succeed and keep their farms going for future generations. We have farmers who are 8th generation farmers going back hundreds of years, vines that are hundreds of years old, and our focus in the last few months has been to ensure that farmer succession, that sustainability, not just of the actual land, but of the farmers' livelihoods as well. I'll pause there and talk a bit more about what we're actually doing a little later.
Sounds great. It's right. There's a lot that goes into 18 acres is pretty small, right? But there's just a lot that goes into growing cranberries and a lot of opportunity, as you know, there as well in terms of what can be done, right, to advance. And maybe could I have you just speak a little bit more around regenerative agriculture and just what that entails in your mind and what your crews in that space?
So for us, it means leaving the planet a better place than we found it. Basically, for every 1 acre of cranberry bed, we conserve about 5.5 acres of surrounding wetland, forest, grassland, or natural lands. And the way we like to look at our regenerative agriculture is across those 6 pillars I mentioned. So our water conservation practices, making sure we're recycling at least 90% of the water that we use, our soil health in terms of reducing erosion and stabilizing our beds, which we rely very heavily on ag tech on, measuring our GHG emissions and ensuring that we actually are sequestering carbon. We turn to our worker health and safety there too. Again, in order to be regenerative, we need to make sure that our farmers and the workers on the farms are safe and secure. And then our ecosystem and biodiversity, just making sure that we have an active ecosystem regeneration, pollinator habitat, and conservation easements. Some more specifics to that is going back to the ag tech piece, we've recently joined the America Connect Coalition, which with Land O'Lakes to bring broadband to farms across the country. We see great success with regenerative farming when it comes to being able to measure soil moisture and cranberry bed temperature through our probes, which then can connect to auto irrigation systems to allow us to only have irrigation turn on and off, or to protect the bed when needed, when temperatures reach certain levels. Also allows us to have cranberry laser bed leveling to make sure we're as efficient as possible, but none of that can be possible without ability to have tech on farms and Wi-Fi on the farms. So leaning into that coalition has been important to us in the last few months. I hope that answers your questions more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. You know, regenerative agriculture has been such a buzzword, right? And it's great to see the commitment of so many companies moving forward. I know just my backyard, General Mills, right, is very supportive of regenerative agriculture, and Cargill just made a big announcement here in Minnesota as well on regenerative agriculture, and it's great to see the effort in that space. I might transition to our next theme that we have that I want to talk about here as well, and that is around opportunities and practices for innovation in the agricultural industry. I think as we heard from this first segment, there's a lot that's going on and a lot of opportunity, and several different crops and new crops, and right, thousands, hundreds of thousands of producers, millions of producers, right, that are being right, working the land every day and putting sustainability practices into their operations. And Joe, I'm going to start with you and your role at the university. You come across with all sorts of startups as you look at the translational research and looking at what has opportunity to advance sustainable agricultural practices. And maybe you could speak to some of the emerging innovations that you're seeing that you think have a bright future towards tackling some of these challenges that we face towards a more sustainable agricultural future.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I think that the domains of innovation are probably not as surprising as the details of the innovation. And I think one of the domains in which we can all see incredible advances happening right now is in the use of information technology. Now, that's kind of a big umbrella. We can easily just say, yeah, that's the Internet of everything, right? Well, but what happens in agriculture is it has a macro version. And we've seen in that you go from, aerial, you go from land-based monitoring to aerial to satellite to surveillance of yield to quality metrics. And you get this overhead picture that's a macro scale at essentially the whole national or even global level. So we've seen all kinds of technology in that space. One company called SIBO Technologies, is a spin out of Michigan State, has been, through many rounds of financing, raised, I think, $70 million or so of follow-on capital. Bottom line is, it's almost all about sustainability. What can we measure that allows the precision and the intervention and the non-intervention strategies we're using to be more effective and essentially a feed-forward virtuous loop going forward? Well, that happens at the macro scale, where we're seeing, I think, an even more interesting application of technologies at the micro scale. Monitors, sensors, systems to gather real-time actionable information in all different areas: soil, atmosphere, weather, insect impact, etc. and monitor, collect, and in real time make decisions, either at a very macro level, let's say a regional level, or at the micro level. So what's happening is I see the scaling effect of technology is an economy of scope. The scope of information is so broad, it's allowing the impact of technology to affect the farmer at the farm level. So that's different than economies of scale. It's essentially bringing the economies of scale of information down to the individual decision maker. So we have this incredible confluence of technology applications. I could go on and on with that. A couple other big ones. I won't go much further with it. Animal agriculture, for example, application of monitoring of motion, mobility, pose, et cetera, audio systems to monitor health and wellness of animals, manage the care and essentially intervene as necessary nutritionally or medicinally. And I'll just throw one other one in terms of animal agriculture, because I think this is one that sometimes when we say agriculture, we think it's all about crops. Nutraceuticals, food as medicine. We're seeing this theme in lots of different ways, lots of investments going into it, diversification of agriculture. We've already heard mention about that already. But that not only applies to human health, that system of thinking, that category of ideas is also being really rapidly developed in terms of animal agriculture, animal wellness, and essentially quality of the derivative proteins. And so food as medicine is making its way back into the things our animals, et cetera, are eating. Bottom line is there's a whole litany of technology, science, discovery, input, and impact being done in those areas today. There's just a few areas. We're seeing lots of technology in all of those. And in some cases, it will be spin-outs. But of course, agriculture, commercialization is very often through the licensing of existing entities. A lot of this IT stuff, a lot of companies, Cargill, for example, a big Minnesota company, and other companies who are moving lots of animals and crops around the world already. And this technology can easily fill in their supply chain resiliency requirements. So that's where we're seeing a lot of activity today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And your point on precision agriculture and just the digital side, and the back to Christina's point on broadband, right, and the need to have broadband available to our producers to utilize or write that data, or have the analytical insights of making those changes and collecting it, right, as well. It's crosses into agriculture quite broadly. And then I couldn't agree more on food as medicine or feed as medicine, right? We're seeing as well just such great interest in that space, and a lot of opportunity there. And I'm going to turn it over to Kate. I see she's unmuted here.
Yeah. I wanted to jump in with an audience question as we're kind of talking about opportunities here, and I think this can be certainly served up to anyone on the panel. So someone's asking, when we talk about switching to regenerative agriculture, it's obviously quite a challenge to undo processes and systems that have been in place for a very long time and have been developed without really taking into account environmental externalities and sustainability. So what are large corporate companies doing, as well as what is the opportunity for new early stage companies to help undo these processes, relatively rapidly, or what's the opportunity there to help kind of break out of the traditional practices and really adopt these new environmentally friendly and sustainable practices? So both ends of that, whoever would like to jump in.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. It's a great question. And I think that, for us, as we're looking at regenerative agriculture and transforming into practices that promote soil health, of course, that introduces new risks to the farm, right, in terms of that transition, and also, things that are embedded in the way that farmers produce. One of the approaches that we're taking is the use of model farms, where we're able to trial these technologies, not just in a single row trial, but as a part of a large scale farm that's done in rotation with other crops. And so that's a model that we're using in different countries, and sort of using the showing, not telling method, and really identifying key farmers in those communities to look at, how do we work with them to, maybe if it's partially funding some of that conversion, and looking for those key influencers in those communities to help drive that. I think another piece, and I think this is an area that we're really just starting to get into, is again, what is the role of finance, and how do we bring incentives into that for farmers? So I think it's one where we really need to bring the financial institutions on board of how do we think about financing for regenerative practices.
Yeah, it's a great point. I know I was part of a group in December of last year. It was around 40 people. They got together to talk about how do you finance, what's the capital investment look like for regenerative agriculture, and just the unknowns yet in terms of thinking that through. But those discussions are happening, right, which is so encouraging to see.
Well, that's where I think that the being able to quantify impact and being able to put a value on that impact is so key. And that's one thing that I think really needs, where corporates can step in and really help to define what are those impact metrics and how are we building that out at a larger scale.
Could I throw in a comment here on the micro side of this? Because I think the question involved what happens at the farm level. One of the I think reawakenings that we see happening, especially in the upper Midwest and probably much across the Midwest, is the recognition of soil organic carbon as a very useful measurable metric. And we see this in Michigan, where areas, and so farmers, especially the younger group, are looking at that as a productivity indicator, a KPI. When farmers begin to look at that as a KPI and begin to, and as we get deeper in terms of the analysis and the meaning and the value of that to a farm longitudinally, major investment decisions, major opportunities for microfinance will come into play as well as macro. So it's a really interesting thing. We see it happening. It's a subject of conversation almost daily today, whereas a decade ago, it was hardly ever mentioned. And what's interesting is these conversations are really not tied to climate change most often when they're happening. They're tied to environmental productivity indicators. So you look at this, there's a really interesting synergy of stuff going on that can really drive a lot of beneficial activity, even at the farmer level.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Joe. Christina or John, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add, so we have a lot of really great people working at FAR, and one of them is Lakeisha Odom, who runs our soil health partnership. And she, because of her, FAR is part of this ecosystems market research consortium, which alludes to some of the things that I think Katie was saying, where they're looking to create a functional ecosystem market service, measuring outcomes and not practices, focused on soil health, storing carbon in soils, reducing nutrient runoff, et cetera. And FAR is really part of that to fund, our funding is going towards quantifying, monitoring, and verifying the environmental impacts of ag producers' conservation efforts, and to recognize them and hopefully pay them for that one day. So that is one thing that, one of the areas that FAR is working on through our soil health challenge area, and Lakeisha.
And just to add to that, the barriers piece, how do we undo that? I think a piece of the conversation we need to bring in is the business case for it. You're seeing more and more consumers, younger generation, want products, want food that has been grown sustainably or regeneratively or in some way good for the planet. And not only that, we're starting to see retailers have requirements to that end, more so in Europe right now than in the States, but that trend is growing. And in removing barriers, having that data and having that business case to make as to why we need to do this and why it'll be profitable, not just for the company, but for the farmers themselves in the future, goes a long way. That data is very much still being developed day to day, and we're still learning, but it is an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, right? Farmers are very astute businessmen, right, in terms of they're going to implement things that bring economic returns to them, and that is a critical piece of the component of finding those double wins or triple wins, right, in terms of what we're all looking for. I'm gonna, this is a great conversation. Kate, are there any other questions that we want to jump into right now? Otherwise, I might ask Katie, quick, just to jump in on, you run it, or are part of an accelerator at AB InBev as well, and maybe you could speak to just a few of the interesting projects or companies that you've worked through the accelerator, and just how those are being taken from idea, right, accelerated through there, and then put into implementation?
Yeah, sure. So, I'll talk about a few of the startups that we've identified through our accelerator. But first, I just wanted to mention too that the space around ag tech and analytics is something that we've been working on for many years, and we have been partnering with a few really interesting startups in that space. One of them being Centera. So through our own Smart Barley platform, we've been collecting field level data and have been working with this startup out of the US called Centera, that they're bringing in this remote sensing data where we can pair that with that field level data to build out those in-season analytics, as well as you know, sort of that longer term planning too. So we're doing some interesting things in that space. But what we've been doing through our accelerator, and again, our accelerator is to look at, you know, where are there startups and technologies that we can source to help us achieve our sustainability commitments. We have been working with, so I mentioned that we're working across 13 different countries, and we're working with smallholders in many of those countries, in places like Uganda and Zambia and India, which introduces a whole host of other challenges to the equation. And so one of the startups that we were working with through the accelerator is a US-based startup called BankU. They're a blockchain-enabled platform who are bringing transparency to the last mile. So in many of these markets, we work through aggregators where we don't have visibility back to the farmer level. And you know, BankU is a simple blockchain platform where we can, you know, it just requires that the farmers to have a simple basic phone in that. But it gives greater visibility so that we know who our farmers are, how much they're being paid, when they're being paid, as well as gives us greater visibility into the flow of product through our supply chain. So that's one example. One other that we've built on top of that, because you know, we're building an economic identity for these farmers where it's typically, you know, a very informal market, pen and paper type record of transactions, looking at how do we leverage that to gain greater access to financial services for these farmers. And one of the, so we've, in our second cohort, we piloted an Israeli startup called OKO, that's OKO, and they're a weather-based crop insurance. And we're trialing them in Uganda right now. So that's really exciting for, you know, we're working with barley farmers there who have historically not had access to insurance. And we're getting this microinsurance down to the farmer level. We trialed that this year. Of course, COVID has introduced some challenges to that, but we're seeing some really promising results from that. And I think that, you know, of course, that's in the smallholder context, but I think that the, you know, weather index-based crop insurance is just something interesting that we can learn from and sort of think about how do we disrupt the general insurance model as it stands today.
Fascinating. Yeah, those the market needs, right, of different markets, and finance and insurance being so critical. Back to your point on Centera, I of course they're in my backyard here as well, and I did get a kick out of ag tech firms. I think their address that they listed was their longitude latitude, right? Just thinking of how they look at their marketplace and right, and what their role is in terms of helping meet some of these sustainability challenges. I'm gonna pivot over to John here quick as well on the opportunities and challenges. You've spoken to it a little bit already, but is there anything else that you want to add on how public-private partnerships can influence some of these challenges and help move some of these opportunities forward?
Yeah, I mean, I first want to echo what Katie said. Again, you know, one of the things that we are interested in is some of these distributed ledger technologies, and for small, mid-sized farmers getting access to markets, whether they're institutions or whatnot. But in regards to your question, you know, I really think that public-private partnerships can help drive the conversation, because it helps us really identify some of the industry needs and where the future is going, and we can connect them to scientists in the academic world, so we can really be a bridge for a gap between industry and scientists. And so through doing that, we identify areas that we think are ripe for innovation. So for instance, one of our areas is indoor farming. I know that indoor farming can be controversial sometimes, and the economics behind it can be controversial, but it's a new industry. And one of the areas that we're looking at is how to adapt plants to these indoor systems. So we identified that area by getting with the industry and saying, what do we need to do to make this new type of farming method successful? And that's called Precision Indoor Plants, PIP. So we'll be announcing some projects there in the relatively near future. Within there, we're also working on accelerated breeding technologies, which we know a lot of companies, seed companies, are interested in. And another one of our consortiums, the Crops of the Future, is also working on that. So the accelerated development of diverse crop species into our systems. We get to hear a lot about automated farming, not just for the regular crops we all think about, but also specialty crops. Ingredients, new ingredients and formulations, and all the innovation that comes with processing and all that down the road.
Perfect, thanks, John. Christine, anything, I know you talked about challenges on the business case here a little bit ago. Are there any other challenges that you see for your producer members in terms of adopting sustainable practices?
For our farmers themselves, not really. It's just that access. I think I agree with John that public-private partnership is so important. A lot of the conservation innovation grants provided by several states are huge drivers of our ability to implement certain practices on our farms, and those grants and that funding is priceless to us. I think a challenge, going to also what Joe said, is making sure we're taking a holistic approach to it. So we are focusing on health of people and planet, and we do see the both being very connected through the new concept of intersectional environmentalism. But as we try and push forward sustainability practices, it's very much siloed right there and separate from practice towards health and nutrition. I think that's where public-private partnership can actually come in and start looking at policy holistically in that sense, as well as tying it to the rest of the supply chain, right? So our focus on regenerative agriculture, we're having success. We have actually been verified as sustainably grown through Sustainable Agriculture Initiative across all of our farmland for 3 years. We're planning to continue that moving forward, but we want to make sure we're tying that to the supply chain as a whole, and building toward a circular economy. And we do see a lot of silos across those different pillars. Again, we can't do it alone, for what Katie said. So trying to identify key partners in that sense to work together and drive forward a more holistic approach.
Fantastic, thank you. No, the collaborations are increasingly important, it feels like, in terms of that connectivity across the value chain. I know we see that more and more, right? Just that desire for collaborating and coming together to help solve some of these major challenges. Kate, it looks like you're unmuted. I'll turn it back to you for a question from the audience.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with a quick question while we're talking about challenges, and I think we're starting to touch on this a bit, but you'd be interested from this group if there's any kind of specific policy or regulatory roadblocks that you could identify or share, either in the US or globally, that impact the work that each of you do. So we've talked a bit about partnerships and kind of the tech side and the business case, and so just curious if anyone can shed a little bit of light on kind of the policy and regulatory scene as it impacts your ability to make progress on sustainable ag.
So I wouldn't say a specific policy, or I'm sure there is, but it's just not coming to mind. But for our Ocean Spray's perspective, cranberries are a special. First, I will thank the USDA for all the help that they have provided to farmers in the last few months. It's been very important. Looking at longer term, specialty crops, I'm sure it's not just cranberries. There are such different needs and variations to different crops in the way they are grown. And sometimes policy kind of lumps it into specialty and large. And we need a little more nuance in being able to leverage policy in a way that will actually help our farmers without having to get through so much red tape, because we actually grow on vines. It's just a little more customization, I think, would be helpful.
Fantastic. No, that's a great point. I know I grew up on a farm, and as well, and every crop and every farm, soil type, right, weather that they face, right, it's just, everything is very micro focused. Going back to Joe's comment earlier, right? It's very, very unique challenges across the different crops and the different growing regions as we look at implementation. There's no one size fits all, right? It's definitely a much more nuanced approach as we work towards this. And that's where I think those collaborations come in on best practices that are working, right? It may not work across all regions, but we can take bits and pieces, right? And hopefully continue to move forward in that space as well. Does anybody else want to comment on policy challenges that they might be facing anywhere in the world?
To Christina, I can't think of anything, specifically, but I think having that lens of sort of, especially when you're looking at government support to agriculture, is that, are they looking at it through that sustainability lens as well? And, there's just an example of, we do quite a bit of work in rice in the US. And alternate wetting and drying, which is much better in terms of water reduction and emissions, is currently not covered under federal crop insurance, right? That's not a practice that's covered, and not for any other reason than it's just not a typical practice. And so that's something where I know that they're working to change that. But again, just making sure that incentives are lined up with the right impacts that we want to see.
Perfect.
Can I add one more comment to this? At the farm level, of course, these policy initiatives, these things that people implement to try to achieve some of these objectives have real cost, often, even if they're corporately imposed, real cost to the farmers. So many times there's a resentment that builds up at that level. And I think, as I think the two companies represented here today have already said, they work really hard to keep the group together. That's something that the more it's policy driven as opposed to community embraced, it ends up setting up an oppositional kind of situation, as we see, of course, in certain categories today. I don't think that's necessary, because I think farmers have a tremendous history of being sort of conservation minded and very value centered. So I do think that's you asked the question of what's a hindrance. I think that can certainly be a hindrance down the road if it's essentially done by fiat, basically. I think that's how the farmer would perceive it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. They want to be part of the conversation to find the solution versus being mandated to implement practices. That's very much the mindset mentality. I couldn't agree more on that standpoint. And that actually transitions us well, I think, to one more area that I want to discuss, and it does get back to this business case. Right, for producers, they're small businesses. They're right trying to make a living on the farm as well. And as we look at the opportunities to adopt and to implement sustainable practices, I do want to spend a little bit of time on that in terms of what are some models that are moving forward from a business case to have that economic pull right along with the innovation that's occurring in the sustainability area. And maybe Katie, I'll start with you in terms of you've got your goals for your 2025 plan around 100% of farmers right being skilled and access, and you've spoken to that a little bit already today. How is the economic pull, or what's going on at AB InBev to right work along with giving them the tools as well as the economic incentives to move forward in adopting sustainable practices?
Yeah, I think financial empowerment is a key piece of our goal, and I think that the economics behind it is a key piece to adoption, right? Kind of going back to Joe's point of having it being mandated is not that's a tough pill to swallow. I'm the daughter of a farmer. I understand that dynamic there, and so I think that how we're going to see the scale of these initiatives and adoption is through that economic incentive. And so, whether that's, we look at that within the local context and, what is needed there to help drive that forward, whether it's thinking about the crop insurance, whether it's thinking about access to, cost sharing or, leveraging our contracts to access finance. So it may take on different forms depending on the market and the financial structure within that market. But I just think to say that has to be one of the key factors when we're thinking about these initiatives.
Fantastic. No, and maybe I'll pivot to John here quick as well in terms of you're constantly exploring different mechanisms and thinking about how can research or how can partnerships move forward in terms of working alongside corporates and nonprofits and academia to adopt some of these practices. Can you speak maybe a little bit about how you're looking at the economic side of some of the research that's going on, or any examples that you can share in that space that you're trying to move forward in the sustainability arena?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what everyone else has said. It's about transforming a system, or getting companies or farmers to adopt. It's really going to be about if you can actually make money from it, right? Because nobody's going to do something that they can't make money from. And so for, especially for me, when we start new initiatives, it's always really important for us to say, where are the areas that we can improve and how is that going to help the bottom line? Because we certainly don't want to invest in things that aren't going to have improvements and that aren't going to be adopted in the future. One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that in our soil health portfolio, we have this ecosystems market research consortium. So that is one area that FAR is really pushing ahead, especially in our whole soil health portfolio. Another area that we're beginning to focus more on is just the area of the bioeconomy and circular economy and all these words that you hear people throw around a lot. That one, the bioeconomy includes food, and agriculture, of course. And has been around for a long time, and people have been thinking a lot about how we get other products from food, especially biofuels, and determining the areas that we can actually invest in or that can have an impact in a relatively short amount of time, I think is extremely, it's difficult because there have been some failures within this space for quite some time. So that is kind of the lens that we're looking at that through for bioeconomy. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, no, that's great. I do think the ecosystem market services, as you're talking about, and doing these pilots to figure out value of carbon capture, greenhouse gas reduction, right? Just some of those elements in terms of what incents a farmer, move forward in terms of adopting those practices, and what do those new models or mechanisms look like, I think is a really valuable step forward in terms of thinking about that adoption curve and the business case right alongside of it. Christine, I'm gonna switch over to you. As a producer-owned cooperative, your producers have obviously a critical role throughout the entire value chain that you are working on at Ocean Spray to get product from the field to the consumer. And maybe could you talk just a little bit about the communication that you have across the supply chain with your producers of all the different elements in your value chain that are focused on sustainability?
Sure. So to back up, yes, for the business case of it and what model that's working, I would say the cooperative model is exemplary here. There are some farmers who it's an all for one, one for all, right? So being a cooperative allows us to really make sure our farmers are getting all the most proceeds they can from the business. That being said, in order to have coordination and communication, we do have a grower code book. So growers, to be part of a cooperative, have to follow by a code book that has certain practices in there that are required across all farms. And that's really how we are able to set certain standards. In addition, here's where tech comes back in. We have a grower extranet. So we have like a grower forum where there's updates, there's chat, you can ask questions. And we've recently made that very mobile friendly as well. So we can easily send alerts to cell phones, get messages out to growers rather quickly, both good news, urgent news as we need it. And what else do we do? And we have we recently actually a pivot. We've recently actually brought on a farmer who's wonderful, Jeff LaFleur, former cranberry farmer, as Vice President of Grower Relations. So we actually have a Vice President of Grower Relations who is a cranberry farmer himself and really understands the challenges at a much more emotional level that our farmers face and can relate with them to that respect. So he's been wonderful for us for the last year or so. And across those pillars, we actually were able to keep communication active, get to our growers as quickly as we can, and then ensure that practices that we require on our farms are part of the code book as it comes to temperature or renovation or whatever it be. And we look at that annually.
Fantastic. No, it's transparency and communication is so critical, and we're sharing those best practices across members. As you're speaking to there, that's great to hear that the model, the cooperative model, is working really well for Ocean Spray. Joe, I'm gonna end with you here, and then open it up for questions from the audience. But I think John talked about a little bit earlier in terms of the bioeconomy and the work that's going on. Past the producer as well, and looking at adding value to their crops and creating more sustainable products. Again, you come across a lot of unique ideas that you're trying to move into the commercialization space and accelerating those to the marketplace. Can you maybe just speak a little bit about how you're seeing demand from consumers and bio-based products in general, and what are you seeing coming through the innovation pipeline there as well?
Well, I think from a consumer level, everyone's already said it. Consumers are asking for transparency. They're asking for more and more information related to the crops that they're buying, et cetera. And of course, a lot of that IT stuff I mentioned earlier is helping to deliver that. Some of the technologies we already talked about today. One of the areas in which I think we have a longer term, something we've not talked about, and it does relate to the bioeconomy, is sort of the energy side of agriculture, where there's no industry where cost is a bigger issue than in energy. I mean, it drives transportation, it drives agriculture, et cetera. And so biofuels is not real sexy right now. It's not an area of investment, and yet it's a system that is moving forward along with all these other things. And so as you start to look at the sustainability initiatives, the drivers, the desires of people, for example, solar energy, et cetera, the feedback of that into the innovation activity in agriculture is real. And let's just say, at the end of the day, photosynthesis is a direct competitor of photovoltaics. There's a lot of things setting up today for an interesting down the road situation where we're doing photosynthetic energy. Now, we're not there yet, but if you look at the systems in terms of the bioeconomy, we have the ability to advance the enzymes that capture CO2. We have the ability to very efficiently burn fiber. And so you can set up a heat system, by the way. And if you burn cellulose, because it's partially oxidized, not to be a chemist here, but it doesn't produce a lot of the other side products. It produces CO2. You capture the CO2, you feed it into an engineered system that captures most of the CO2. You produce biochar. Biochar is incredibly attractive material that consumers are asking for in a lot of different ways. Let me give you two examples. We've got two examples of the technologies that have come out. Obviously, the agricultural applications of biochar in the soil level are well known. Not all biochar is the same. It has different properties, all of them beneficial, but tunable. Interesting area for innovation. Another application, we have PFAS contamination throughout the US. You can capture a little bit with activated carbon, but if you treat biochar with a certain kind of process, you really increase the capacity of this stuff to capture PFAS. So you've got this whole interesting set of loops of technology that put together an interesting scenario where cellulosic materials, whether they come from the field or from the forest, sustainably grown, are used as an energy source to produce heat, a co-product, again, economies of scale for the farmer, heat, et cetera, capture the CO2, turn it into a series of products, one of which is biochar. Others are perhaps algae that you've grown from the way CO2, because it has an enhanced ability to capture CO2. So again, these are the systems that are really happening today. These are where innovation, these are areas where innovation is occurring. And you look at it down the road and you say, there is a really attractive frontier in the world of bioenergy that we should be excited about going forward.
Yeah, that's a fascinating comment around biochar, and we see a few biochar projects come through our portfolio every year as well. We had one that was just looking at biochar and denitrifying bioreactors, right, in terms of nitrate runoff, and more quickly being able to look at the capacity and the cost of those for implementing on farm. And some really interesting things. Just to your point on PFAS, ARI hosts a open innovation platform every year, and we did have a challenge this year on removing PFAS, right, overall. So I'll have to touch base with you afterwards on helping us solve that challenge through one of our major corporate collaborators on that effort. Turn it back over to you. I see we're getting close to time here.
Yeah, I'd love to squeeze two questions in if I can. The first one, I like this question because we talked a bit earlier about how current processes need to be undone, that were built in a time when we weren't necessarily thinking about environmental externalities. So to anyone who'd like to think about this and answer this, when you look ahead and think about really educating and connecting with the next generation of farmers, that could, really be implementing new processes or kind of starting from the beginning with thinking about this double bottom line and being economically viable, but also sustainable. Do you have initiatives or thoughts or efforts underway to really reach the youth and the next generation to make sure that this is something that can be more embedded from the start in their farming and their processes?
Hi, sorry, it was me. Yes, just chiming in. So in terms of the next generation, we actually have launched a new initiative called Ocean Spray Academy, which is a learning course for our growers across different regions on not just sustainability, but the business as a whole, the future of farming. And that kicks off in November, and we were seeing great feedback there. So for the farmers there, yes. We also, on the business side, the business case, we're working really closely with our customers there. So for us, our customers are retailers. It's the Walmart, Targets, Krogers of the world. It's not just a transactional relationship. We have strong relationships with those customers who help us understand what the consumers want, what they want on their shelves, and therefore help us give the data for that business case to be made across our operations. As it comes to regenerative agriculture, it's of the three pillars, I'd say it's actually the easiest to convince, simply because our cranberry farmers are already in doing those practices. Where that data is coming in really helpful is in that overall climate strategy and supply chain strategy that we're trying to develop. But to answer your question, yes. So on the grower side for farmer succession, we have an education effort, a communication effort in place. And then on the business side, we're working closely with our customers to develop data to drive business decisions internally.
Anyone else want to comment on that question? Otherwise, Kate, we'll let you ask the next one.
Great. Okay, so I think maybe we'll squeeze this last one. It's a bit more general, so maybe zooming out a bit. This was a question from the start. We've heard about a lot of different technologies and innovations, certainly no shortage of things that can be leveraged. And so someone from the audience is curious to understand how each of you keep a pulse on new tech that's emerging that can realistically be leveraged by companies. So what are kind of your mechanisms for kind of having a good understanding of what's out there, what's emerging, and kind of what's ripe for opportunity?
I can quickly say, because mine's really short, I get applications for grants from people that are doing the innovation work. Mine's easy.
You have a process. No, that's great. Well, and so similarly to Joe, that's where we look to leverage our accelerator. But I think also, we have teams on the ground who are part of these ag communities. So, we're able to have a better sense of what's going on, within countries and within that space. And, I get lots of emails and lots of LinkedIn pings. So always happy to take that and to explore new topics. But I think, that the accelerator is a really great platform for us to be able to source those new ideas.
We have both news tracking capabilities that track certain buzzwords for us to get alerts as things launch, as well as an internal incubator called the Lighthouse Incubator, which tracks developments. I cannot speak to how. They're amazing.
Yeah, I would say for me specifically, it's engagement with stakeholders. Stakeholders have a lot of this type of information, where they're accelerators, universities, applications that we get, papers for projects just to scope what needs to happen in a specific space to make it more successful. So our network is a really huge part of that.
Yeah, and I may just completely agree. The collaboration, the network of being engaged in the ecosystem or having a vibrant ecosystem to engage in is just very, very helpful. And then I think from Joe's comment too, we receive several applications or client ideas every year that we're taking a look at or getting a pulse of what's going on or where their interest levels are in terms of innovations that they're trying to move forward overall. And then we do a lot of public initiatives to try to share the word, right, and spread the word around, as well around seeing around corners is the way that we term it, in terms of putting new ideas out into the marketplace for businesses to consider in terms of where trends might be moving.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That brings us right to time, just a couple minutes over. So appreciate everyone hanging in there with us. So thank you to all of our audience who spent the last hour with us, and a big thank you to our panel and Shannon, our moderator. This was an excellent discussion. There were so many questions we didn't get to, but really appreciate you all sharing your insight and perspective with us, and just great to have you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.